So remember with number 5, right? Be sure to watch the video from last week.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the popular interpretations that we covered is one is the salutary neglect thesis, that we were neglected by England, but it had a healthy or salutary effect upon us. It's number 1 in the handout, and that's the argument that the British have commonly displayed in their history books about losing us as their colonies. Is that she never really put her foot down with the mercantilist restrictions, and we economically kind of defied them and did what we wanted to from the get-go, and we became accustomed to that and began succeeding well economically in that sort of rebellious state. And that also our assemblies in particular, our elected reps at the colonial levels, obtained certain powers that were never really deliberately intended to be given to them, right? But nevertheless, just through circumstances, it organically happened that way, that the assemblies became rather powerful. Uh, and so then at the end of the French and Indian War, the British decided to crack down on us, right? And so, and also be sure you read the introduction to it, because what's commonly seen as context to the War for Independence is in there, including population changes, migrations, reasons for which England felt like she needed to grab a hold of the 13 colonies a little more tightly. Okay. And then you have Bernard Bailyn's court history, that ideas, right, that fundamental ideas um, circulated the Atlantic Ocean, and we imbibed them. We took them in, and we began believing in them, and it gave us a higher intolerance of tyranny, and gave us a higher sense of entitlement to our rights when we read about these works. And matter of fact, we could use that to segue to the some of the material we're going to do today on numbers 10 through 15. Okay, so kind of jumping here to number 12, state level quote democracy during and after the War for Independence. Okay, so that's number 12 on test number 2 on our study guide. Is during the War for Independence, right? Pamphleteering took off. People started, Thomas Paine's Common Sense was the most popular um, and widely read. But lots of like 13 to 35 page pamphlets were written, and a lot of them were modeled after about 3 sources. One source, obviously, is the Enlightenment. And with the Enlightenment, and we're kind of going back to the number 4 as well at the same time on the test. With the Enlightenment, right? Remember, they were deists, and they believed that there are natural laws by which things operate, and they felt like that which is natural is healthy and ought to be embraced, as opposed to that which is arbitrary and man-made and so forth, which is unhealthy. And so what they decided, right, like with the writings of Rousseau and John Locke and others, is that these philosophers kind of deducted that they think the first people were born free in a state of nature, and as nomadic hunter-gatherers, free as can be, right? And it's the idea of the social contract. But eventually, enough people began abusing their freedom, they surmised, that they started infringing upon the natural rights of others, taking their stuff, enslaving them against their will, harming them physically, extorting them, etc. So that government, they think, was theoretically and actually historically derived as a necessary evil by consent. That those who were free said they did a cost-benefit analysis and said, well, I love my natural freedom, but it's gotten where I am more afraid for my life and my stuff and my liberty than I am in favor of my freedom. So I'm willing to curtail or cut short my freedoms limitedly in order to have a government that will protect those freedoms. And so with a social contract, that notion circulated the colonies, and so they wanted virtually as many government positions as possible to be elected, right? To be given consent or permission from the people below them. They wanted their new state constitutions that they were devising during the War for Independence, the 13 colonies, as we were fighting England. They began devising their own declarations of independence and their own constitutions. And a lot of the people began demanding, through the spirit of that age of the Enlightenment, that there be much accountability and must be the people's consent to these new rulers of their states. And so we were in a real enlightened mood, so to speak, during the War for Independence. And so any questions?
No.
Okay. And also Montesquieu was real big. But let me, before I get to Montesquieu, stay with Rousseau and Locke. But the idea was, right, is the government is our servant, not our master. It serves us. It exists to protect our natural rights. And they concluded those natural rights are life, liberty, and property, right? And then Jefferson would add pursuit of happiness. And I think he was quoting Diderot, Condorcet, and Aristotle, and them saying, talking about the natural God-given right to cultivate yourself, to become educated, to learn a trade, and go as high as you can up the socioeconomic ladder without anyone arbitrarily impeding your progress. And so at any rate, you had Beccaria, and he was into the rights of suspects, right? So a lot of our amendments in the Bill of Rights are modeled after Beccaria's writings, as far as the right to keep your things against arbitrary seizures of your stuff, the right to countermand your hostile witnesses, have someone represent you, not be tortured and forced to confess something that may or may not be true, right? Self-incrimination, the right to remain silent. And so a lot of those things were percolating at this time. Also, as far as freedom of religion and freedom of expression and freedom of the press, I mentioned before Voltaire, right? So Voltaire was real big on that. He was a big iconoclast. He made fun of things that were held sacred, and he claimed that it was his God-given right to do so. Back in France, he had to flee the country because he got in trouble with the powers that be for that which he wrote against them. But those are all examples of the Enlightenment. And then also, of course, Montesquieu, the idea of checks and balances, the idea that that there needs to be balance in government, especially as far as different classes or factions. Remember, a faction is a group that shares the same self-interest and or the same ideology, the same belief system. And so that one single faction should not prevail over everyone else, lest they become tyrants themselves. So there needs to be a system of checks and balances that we're familiar with in our Constitution. So that came from Montesquieu, right? But also the second source, in addition to the Enlightenment, was Scottish liberalism. And it later is going to be, it's kind of morphed into classical liberalism. And it's not like today's liberalism. It's actually, ironically, it's libertarian. They want as little government involvement in people's lives as possible, these classical liberals, especially the Scots. So to them, right, mankind ought to be as free as humanly possible to practice and do whatever it is he wants to do. I know this is silly, but when I think of Scottish liberalism, I think of Ron Swanson on Parks and Rec. But that guy cracks me up.
I don't think I've ever seen it.
Oh, you haven't seen it? Yeah, but he's funny. He's a mustachioed alpha male, and he hates government. It says government ought to just stay away from our lives as much as possible, and we ought to be as free as possible to pursue our own self-interest, etc. Right? And so with Scottish liberalism, you have notions like you don't want the government, you want the government to be as accountable as possible, right? So for one, you want government to stay small and localized if you were an old school Scottish libertarian or liberal. So the idea is rather simple, right? Is for one, people that live locally and govern locally, they know the conditions better, right? So think about Washington, D.C. We have to have a rep who has a residence in our congressional district. But throughout most of the year, that rep, he or she does not live here, but is living in Washington, D.C. Scottish liberals would have hated that. They wanted the idea of our reps to remain and stay with the very people that they're governing, right? Was there a question, hon?
No.
Okay. So, so they wanted government to stay localized and small. And that's another idea of it, of them being local. Is another one is that most of the time it stood to reason that if it's local, it's not going to have too many resources. It's not going to be able to become this behemoth, this Leviathan, as Hobbes would call it, this big, huge state, right, apparatus, because it's small. It's just local. And then lastly, they liked it local because literally they could tell their politicians, right, I know where you live. And so a sense of more accountability if you're a governing official and you're just governing at the local level along with your constituents. So to them, right, to a lot of the Scottish liberals, they wanted a constitution that guaranteed and maximized human rights, right? Natural rights that they contended people are entitled to. And I mentioned like life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, expression, to protect themselves. The Scottish liberals were real big on what would become our Second Amendment rights, to protect yourself with guns, etc. And so not only were they into a constitution that safeguarded people's rights, but they also were for a confederacy. A confederacy to me is virtually a loose alliance of autonomous states. Being autonomous means to me just being independent and determining your own destiny. With a confederation, each state is virtually autonomous. It could have its own economic system and print its own money. It obviously can have its own laws. It could dictate things to people from outside the state when they come in, that no matter what rights they're accustomed to in their home state, that they reserve the right to have completely different requirements and laws and obligations in theirs once the stranger enters their territory. And so this type of confederacy, right, is what we formed during the War for Independence. So notice, right, a lot of these new governments at the 13 colonies becoming states now while we're fighting England and breaking free from her, they're writing constitutions that are declaring human rights. They're having checks and balances in the system of their state governments. And they have basically a very loose confederation or alliance with one another, but are virtually autonomous individually. And that's the way they wanted it to be. And so then lastly, what I want to mention is they were rather that relative to the past, relative to even their time period in the late 1700s, they also were very democratic. And remember, demos just means the common people in Greek. So the idea was, right, is that if you're for a mixed government like Montesquieu wrote about, like Aristotle had written about, right, that the wealthy who are well educated, they represent one faction and they ought to represent one branch of the government, but only one branch, right? And then the common farmers, right, they ought to have someone representing them in government, the different artisans or skilled workers, the later factory workers, et cetera, right? The idea of each of these factions, no single faction should prevail over any other. Otherwise, you'll have tyranny, wrote and read the founding fathers. So at any rate, what a lot of them decided is that in the inevitable chance of one faction seeming to gain a little bit more influence over power than another, the founding fathers are going to disagree as to which faction they ought to grudgingly accept as the most influential, as the most powerful. So to the conservatives, right, like particularly John Adams, who became our second president, Alexander Hamilton, and for the time being, James Madison, right? What they concluded is they would rather have the well-bred have a little bit more power than the common people. And their arguments were very simple. It was very simple, and that is that, for one, they went to they had the common snobbery that they brought with them as a heritage from England, and which was somehow the notion that those who had become nobles went all the way back to the time of King Arthur and fighting the Romans, right, and fighting the barbarian uh, um, the Romans fighting the barbarian Goths and Vandals and other barbarian armies that took down Rome, right? Is that they literally came from the leader's blood back then. And so that nobility ran in their blood, that they happened to have been, that you go back far enough and their progenitor, their ancestor, had a little bit better DNA than other people, right? As far as being a natural leader and this and that. And we don't have time really to get into the nonsense of that, but it was adhered to, certainly in England. And I think a vestige of it was carried over by John Adams and others, that a lot of the well-to-do and wealthy who were connected to the British nobility did come from, quote, better blood. But more than that, because they didn't want to harp on that too much, because that was very un-American to do that. That sounded very British-like. What they harped on was the fact that the well-to-do were better prepared. So nature and nurture, right? That by nature, which was very controversial even back then, those who were wealthy had better blood running through their veins. But more importantly, what they wanted to emphasize was by nurture, the way they were brought up. They were brought up to become prepared to rule over people. And I think as a case in point was Jefferson's fixation with Plato and Plato's Republic. The idea of having a public school system, setting the kids apart that are especially bright and especially socially healthy. The little kids that will share their chocolate milk and crackers, and also are getting the times table in their math section much more quickly than the others, and are reading at a much better pace and so forth, and their comprehension levels are above the others, that they be siphoned off and be separated from the public through an elite school of education subsidized by the government to later rule over the very kids that they'd been separated from. Plato's Republic, right? Jefferson wrote about that, and actually there are signs that suggest he wanted to actually implement that. So to the conservatives, right, they'd say the rhetorical question, do you believe that all human beings, all Americans as well, right, are equal in the rights and opportunities and the protections of the law that they're entitled to? Of course, the answer is yes, right? We take that as an axiom that you don't question. We're all equal as far as what we're entitled to and rights and opportunities that we should have, right? But then if I follow that up and said, well, do you believe that everyone is equally capable of writing a good English paper or fixing your car, right? And of course, that's a rhetorical question. The answer is suggested in it is that, of course, no. Some people are better able to fix a car or to write an English paper. We all have different skills and subsets and talents, right, that we're born with, that we've been able to cultivate, etc. To the conservatives, right, is they thought those well-to-do who go to school, especially through college, which was so out of the ordinary back then, that they are especially trained in political science, for instance, in government. They're especially trained and are given wisdom through the Greco and Roman classics, right? And of course, that's controversial now, but back then it was taken as a truth, is that when you receive a classical education in Greek and Roman works, Aristotle, his Nicomachean Ethics book, he says, if you know something is broken and you hide that while you're selling it to somebody, that's dishonest. As far as having the motive of vainglory, of just wanting to be seen as a hero yourself, but yet you engage in philanthropic acts as a politician and give free food out to the poor and help them out. Like, he gets into deep philosophical questions. Does Aristotle would write, right? Is there truth to to the assertion that living a virtuous life will bring about a happier life, et cetera, et cetera. So the Greeks and the Romans, they did write a lot about introspection, about ontology, like why do we exist, and the purpose of life, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea amongst the founding fathers was that a classical education in Greco-Roman works was going to make you a more well-rounded, polished individual who has had to study human psychology, philosophy, political science, as well as the more practical arts and sciences, right? And so to them, it stood to reason that yeah, if you have something wrong with your car, go to the most able mechanic that you could find. Don't just rely on yourself or a neighbor just because you believe that person is inherently equal to the mechanic in value and opportunities. So any questions on that?
No.
Okay. And so get this, in the Federalist Papers that we'll get to soon, the conservatives actually wrote that elected reps, the idea was, right, I think of like in sports, in professional sports, when the fans are able to participate in voting for all-stars, right? And of course, an undergirding assumption to that is you don't have to be capable of playing baseball or whatever sport it is at a professional level to be able to see talent in someone else, right? That you could recognize talent without having that talent inherently yourself. And so the conservatives said that's the way it ought to be with elected reps, that the common people ought to be able to see someone who would be very capable, very prepared to be their leading politician without having his attributes themselves. So elect someone who's better prepared than they are to do it, right? So at any rate, once that person comes in, that person, the conservatives wrote, is to be a steward. A steward to me is like a babysitter, someone to whom you entrust something that is sacred to you, right? In an act of faith and trust in that person, that we ought to give stewardship over to our elected politicians in Congress. Don't make them be a mouthpiece and just go for whatever laws we want, right? And just serve as our mouthpiece metaphorically, but let that elected rep think for him or herself. That person is better capable than we are. That's why we elected him or her. And that person ought to be able to be free and to have latitude to use his or her own discretion on what's best for us in his or her district. And so, matter of fact, they even went so far as likening an elected rep to a filter. They literally use that term in the Federalist Papers, that sometimes the masses are going to have some ignorant, nearsighted, or even dangerous ideas, and that the elected rep, no matter how popular that cause is, should say no and have the self-control, the wisdom, the intelligence, the education, and preparation to say, no, constituency, I will not succumb to that base wish, right? But then when they have a good or healthy idea, to filter that through and say, yes, I will advocate that for you in the legislature. So notice, okay, the conservatives were pretty elitist, and that they now don't get me wrong, they still wanted elected reps who could be, quote, unelected come time for re-election. They still wanted the common people to have power of participation in the government. But like I said, they wanted, if anything, if any faction prevailed a little bit more over the others in this republic, this mixed government of ours, they would prefer as a lesser evil for us to be closer to an aristocracy. And remember, aristoi means the best in Greek. So ruled by the elite, the best, the most qualified. Okay. And along with that, let me just say one more thing, and then we're done with the conservatives at this time period for now, in explaining them, is they had read, right, Plato and Aristotle again, in which, especially Aristotle, in which they made a very elitist claim that the average person is not equipped to rule very well. And of course, again, the argument is nature and nurture. The nurture part goes without saying from what I've already said, is the average person back then did not have a college education, was not classically trained in the Greco and Roman classics, right? And hence had never been prepared and set aside to rule, and hence was not prepared to do so, not equipped to do so. But the nature part, again, sounds terrible. It sounded terrible even then. How much more now? Is Aristotle contended, right, that some people are created. They say he called them natural slaves, for instance, where Aristotle said some men are created with unusually large, strong physical bodies, but with very feeble minds. And he said God or nature created them to be slaves, to be at the bottom of the pyramid, or else he would have given them a more sharp brain, right? And so that,
Aristotle said that.
yeah, Aristotle said that. Yeah, you can look up Aristotle and natural slaves. That was his term. That sounds terrible, huh?
Yeah.
And so the idea was, right, is he and Plato thought that the average person was led by his or her appetite. And your appetite to me is kind of like your Freudian id, right? With the Puritans in Christianity, it was the flesh, as they called it. Is that it is what you want, right? So a little child, right? Um, I remember my little boy leaving the restaurant, and he was just a little bit bigger than a toddler, and I stopped and began dealing with the bill, and someone had left a plate, and he jumped up onto the chair and started trying to eat someone's food from a plate that had finished and left there for the people to pick up and throw out. And so, right, he was following his id. He didn't think about any logical ramifications. At that moment, he was desiring that cake, and he wanted to jump up and grab it, right? And so then, of course, you have your super ego, right, or your intellect, right, your reason, as the Greeks called it, that says, wait a minute, I want this idea, I like this idea of getting this and indulging here, but it's like your Jiminy Cricket on your shoulder, right, saying don't do that. There will be long-term ramifications if you simply go for that, right? So as an example, American citizens in the 13 colonies wanted land and they wanted credit, right? And it's easy to see why, is they were pursuing the American dream. And those tended to be the best avenues or stepping stones toward the American dream, was to either purchase land and become a cash crop farmer, right? Or to take a loan, credit, and establish some type of business, right? And begin selling a service or a product to the people. And so hence a lot of the paupery elected legislators in the 13 states, and by the way, some of them like Pennsylvania didn't even have a governor who had veto power over the legislator, because they said that they were too wary of having a governor because of the way the governors under Britain, right, had lorded it over the elected assemblies just before and during the War for Independence. And so a lot of these popular legislators were either unicameral, just elected reps, and no one above them in an upper council who had to approve of laws also. Because remember, Montesquieu said there need to be some aristocratic bodies that are unelected and democratic bodies that are, with checks and balances over each other. And so, if anything, right, some of these democratic states began leaning more toward democracy than toward aristocracy. And we talked about the conservatives claiming that, no, it's better to lean toward an aristocracy in a republic more than a democracy, right? Because the common people will be led by their appetite, will be short-sighted in what they want to do, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, what the liberals contended is they would rather have democracy as a lesser evil, because to them, right, they gave a few arguments. One is they talked about the sagacity of the individual. that the average person may not have a college education, may not be classically trained and prepared for governing, but the average person, average American in particular, has good common sense and can read through issues. It can read through politicians and people really well. And so hence has that kind of street smarts, that common sense, wisdom, to be able to do just fine in participating in government. Another argument the liberals made was collective wisdom, that you get one uneducated farmer and one artisan or skilled worker in a city, and you ask them questions, profound questions about government, and they might be completely lost. But you get about 300 of those farmers and about 300 of those artisans, and you put them together in a big room, and somehow collectively they come up with something grand and wise, collectively, right? And so those were a couple common arguments. And then also what Thomas Jefferson popularized is he said, I would rather have rash and ignorant decisions made by the masses, right, than manipulative, tyrannical moves made by aristocrats, right? Because he says the aristocrats are more dangerous because they know exactly what to do and how to do it, right? And they'll do stuff for their own ends. Whereas the people, it's more like an innocent child just making ignorant mistakes. And the results of those mistakes, he said, are not as pernicious. They're not as detrimental or harmful to people's freedoms as would be the manipulative machinations of the wealthy elite who know exactly what they're doing. So any questions on that?
No.
Okay. So during this Confederacy, it was during the War for Independence from 1775 when we started fighting through 1783, and then it lasted 4 more years. We had this first Confederacy, right? Caught up in the Enlightenment and in classical liberalism, have deliberately very, relative to the time period, very democratic states with strong elected legislators and very loosely joined together in a confederation, right? And so during this time is the people began issuing squatters' rights to the people at the expense of Native Americans or at the expense of a nearby colony in the case of the two adjacent colonies having disputes over whose territory ends where, right? That was a quick way to get people's vote. They say, hey, I'll open up more of the Piedmont in Virginia, right, to you poor white Southerners, and I'll open it up. Now you're gonna have to fight the Native Americans, or I know we're fighting with Maryland over that land, but I'm gonna open it up to you as squatters' rights for you to virtually take it for free, right, as farmers. That's gonna carry its own problems and repercussions with it. They said, okay, we're gonna allow easy credit. We're going to subsidize creditors. We're going to help pay lenders to help equip them to lend money to you guys, right? And when they fail to do the job, we'll issue a state level bank. And when things are going, there's not sufficient credit out there, heck, we'll even engage in inflation and we'll just print new money because that's what the people want. That obviously is going to have negative consequences, right? And so what happens in the particular element of the topic of credit is they had some poor harvests in the early 1780s. You had rising prices of agricultural products, or I'm sorry, lower prices for the agricultural products. So profits went down. And so different facets of the international economy caused hard times for the farmers. So in state after state, the poor farmers who had borrowed money to start their cash crop farm defaulted on their loans and they didn't pay their creditors back. Well, they used their strength in numbers and the fact that their government in their state was relatively democratic, and they had the legislator pass stay laws, giving them 5 more years or 2 more years. Oftentimes it was 2, giving them 2 more years to pay off their debt. Well, the creditors are not only furious, the lenders, but they also start going out of business. You can't get in the business of lending money and have no one pay that money back and stay in business for long, right? And so after they were issuing stay laws in 3 states, they passed they passed a law that simply abrogated debt, said you don't that all debts are declared null and void. So now the creditors are never legally going to get that money back. The people were pardoned by whom? By themselves, by their elected reps and their state legislator. Okay. And then in a case that just drove George Washington up the wall, was a case of Daniel Shays in Massachusetts, whereby they had already issued stay laws on a couple occasions to buy themselves time to pay off their debt to their lenders, right? And finally, the legislator had had enough, and they issued a law saying at this certain point, all debts have to be repaid, or else the state is going to collect on those debts. And of course, when you borrow, right, they look at what you have in assets. You have a car, a boat, a house, whatever it might be, right? And they could garnish from that. They could take from your assets as collateral, right, when you default on your loan. And that's what happened. And so that the judges came into Western Massachusetts to make decisions upon debtors. And of course, they were to take their property from them. And also, under English common law, they were to be put in debtor's jail, not for very long, but nevertheless, still, we had debtor's jail all the way up through the mid 1800s in this country's history. Crazy, huh? That you can go to jail for debt. And so when the judges came to do this, right, and put them on trial, a guy named Daniel Shays and others put on their old Revolutionary War soldier uniforms or Minutemen uniforms and actually held the judges at gunpoint and told them to get out, that they were not going to indict and take away and convict a single person for debt in Western Massachusetts. And so when they left, they went even further, and they attacked the sheriff's offices and freed the debtors that were in local jails, right? And then they began amassing an army to fight the state's militia. This happened, something similar to this happened in Pennsylvania as well during the war. And Shays' Rebellion was after the war. So at any rate, right, Washington is like, good God, these people are spoiled rotten. They're getting loans of their own accord. No one's putting a gun to their head. They're failing to pay back their loans and to be financially responsible. And then when law and order comes in to do what millennia has been done in Western civilization, to take their collateral and perhaps put them briefly in debtor's jail, they threaten to kill the judges and attack sheriff offices to violently free the debtors out of the jails. And then they won't disband afterward, but began building an army to fight against their own state militia. And so to George Washington, supposedly by his own account, Shays' Rebellion was the last straw, where he said that this Confederacy is too democratic and is too weak. And so that chaos is ensuing. All right. So going back to the founding fathers.
Question that's
Yes.
probably unrelated, but why is like Confederacy considered racist?
Good question. Because the stars and bars of the quote Confederacy, because this what we're talking about now is called the Articles of Confederation.
Mm-hmm.
And that Articles of Confederation, right? They passed something called the Northwest Ordinances, and they declared that the land in future states to the west around the Great Lakes area, so like Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, right? They declared that as those were being peopled, and they would be taken in from unincorporated territory to become actual states, that there would be no slavery allowed anytime in the future in that area. So that old Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, they were big on human rights. They were big on democratic government and the states having their own powers. And they were big on, as a unit, slavery not being extended anywhere else where other than where the other states already allowed it to be. During the Civil War, as we get to the end of the class, the Confederacy, as it's known, right, under Jefferson Davis, that from the get-go issued a statement saying, admitting, right, and I'll probably show this to you later in the semester, specifically stating that they in particular were not just fighting for states' rights, because they claimed a lot of the issue was states' rights, that Alabama ought to decide what to do with slavery, that in the new opening West, Kansas and Nebraska ought to decide what they want to do with slavery, and the government should stay out and keep its nose out, right? So they not only were fighting for states' rights to conclude the issue of the slavery issue, but even together as a confederacy, they signed a statement saying that they, by and large, were fighting for the right to keep their slaves, right? And then not to mention also is they made agreements as far as runaway slaves, to take slaves that had run away from Alabama and gone into Georgia. The Georgians were obligated and volunteered to give those runaway slaves back to the state of Alabama and let them be punished accordingly, right? They cooperated with each other to show largely a commitment to keeping African Americans enslaved, and for the small demographic of African Americans who had become freed and gained manumission or freedom, they cooperated in keeping them discriminated through what they call black codes. So from the get-go, right, the Confederacy during the Civil War was much more in agreement in giving no rights to African Americans and keeping them enslaved. Whereas the Confederacy we're talking about now just kind of grudgingly allowed the southern states to do their own thing with slavery. But when it came to going anywhere else, it took a stand and was against it. Mm-hmm. And not to mention, right, at least I think 5 of these states declared freedom for slaves, 5 of the northern states. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
No problem. So yeah, when you see the star and bars, that's the Confederacy of the Civil War era, and it symbolizes something much more racist than this Confederation we're talking about now.
Yeah.
All right. And so, Nova, I'm glad you asked that question. By all means. And so, and then also, we're almost done here, I promise, is Pennsylvania and Virginia almost went to war over territory that they both were claiming as their own in the frontier regions. New York and New Jersey began taxing each other's products and giving special taxes on each other's merchants that were crossing the New Jersey-New York line to do business in the adjacent state. And it became known as a commercial war, going back and forth. They both got very petty, very punitive in punishing each other, and they were for their state alone. Pontiac's Rebellion and a couple other Native American rebellions. The states asked for volunteers from all states to help fight in their collective army or militia against the Native American rebellions. And several states in each case said no. And so the army that they brought forth was pretty pathetic and actually on several occasions lost to the Native Americans. So my point being, going back to this, is the founding fathers, both liberal, who were libertarian at that time, right? I think of like Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, and the conservatives, who like John Adams and Hamilton, right, were for a more aristocratic type republic of a government. they had read their Greco-Roman stuff, and they had read that in the past, democracy was discouraged by people like Aristotle and Plato. When you look under a guy named Pericles in Athens in like the 3rd century BC, it got a little crazy, their form of democracy there in Athens. And so hence they had read that democracy doesn't work. It's too messy. People will be led by their id, right? And be short-sighted, don't have the self-control, don't have the education and preparation to rule well. So when things happen like Shays' Rebellion, right? And wars with Native Americans so that people could just buy people's vote by offering them Native American lands to squat on, is the conservatives could look to the liberals and say, ha, I told you so. Did we not read in our Greco-Roman works that democracy is too messy, right? And so the idea is, with number 1 of this week's assignment, is that the people in the states, when we tried this confederation out, behaved in such a rash, selfish, and a bit chaotic manner that it played right into the hands of the conservatives, who could tell the liberals, I told you so. We need to have a less democratic government than we have right now. Okay? And then secondly, the conservatives could say, look at the Confederacy, look at the Confederation of the Italian city-states during the Renaissance. Look at the Scandinavian countries and their attempt at having a confederation, which by the way, I've read of the Italian city-states. I've not read a thing on the Scandinavian, so I'm just mentioning them because the Founding Fathers mentioned them as another example. But I know nothing about the specifics. But what I do know is the Founding Fathers, in reading both those instances, said that confederacies, right, are a mess as well. They create chaotic jealousy and fighting between the states, weakness as far as being able to bring forth an army, and makes them vulnerable to invasion from a foreign foe. And so that a confederation does not work well either, right? And so hence, with number 1, things happened in such a way that conservatives, it played into their hands and said, we're able to convince enough people that were in the middle, enough moderate liberals. We're able to convince them, see, guys, we told you, we need a less democratic republic and we need a more powerful central government, okay, than a confederation, than a confederacy. And then in the midst of that, of the liberals kind of learning that things weren't going well in this confederacy, was number 15, the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are 85 or 87 short essays written namely by Madison and Hamilton and John Jay, conservatives, right? And they're very interesting. If you've ever read some of it or you haven't, if you're interested, I would recommend looking into it. But in these short essays, is they would try to allay the fears of the liberals and trying to claim that history points, logic and hypothetical points that they use. So they use logic and inductive reasoning. They refer to different civilizations of the past, right? And it was their kind of sophisticated intellectual way of convincing the liberals, see, we need a less democratic and a more centralized government for very practical and historical reasons. Any questions on that, you guys?
No.
Okay. And so we've covered number 10, Articles of Confederation, alleged problems. So we've covered the problems, right? Number 12, we've covered state level, quote, democracy during and after the War for Independence. We've covered that. We've covered number 15, the Federalist Papers. All right. And so what are they going to come up with? What kind of government are they going to devise at this constitutional convention when they scrap the Confederation? Is let's do it word for word, okay? On number 13. So firstly, the first word that I would use and I'll have on the test is constitutional. So notice, even the conservatives, who were rather elitist and snobbish, right? Even they adhered to a lot of the basic principles of the Enlightenment and to Scottish liberalism. And one of those foundational assumptions that they shared with the liberals was that there's something about human nature that cannot be trusted, that you can't give anyone unlimited power, or else he or she inevitably will become a tyrant and abuse that power. And as I may have mentioned before, Thomas Jefferson wrote that to John Adams in their debates as a liberal to a conservative. He said, you know yourself that even you and I would become wolves if the people let us. Okay? So a rule by a person or a group of people are fallible. People can get drunk with power. People can be arbitrary, right? Arbitrary, no rhyme or reason or pattern or consistency. They're one way yesterday, and they're completely different, and their policies become different tomorrow. With a constitution, that is to safeguard people's natural rights, okay, and have them on paper so that they'll be more likely to be guaranteed. And a written constitution is colorblind. It's not prone to be arbitrary and change randomly back and forth. Whatever's written on a constitution is there, and it's going to stay written in stone. So both conservatives and liberals wanted a constitutional government that says what the government can and cannot do, rights that the people were entitled to, etc. So firstly, the type of government devised in 1787, number 13 on the test, we have a constitutional. The next word is federal, Federal. The federal part is a balance between a confederacy, which we had, and a unitary government. A unitary government would be, there would not even be a need to have municipal or city laws, county laws, state laws, that Washington, D.C. would provide legislation and enforce the law in every single city and state in the Union. So clearly our central government is not that powerful. We haven't given it that much power. That's a unitary government. So the idea of federalism is it's a balance. So you'll notice next week, Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution says Congress shall be able to do this and this and this and this, right? A lot of those powers given to Congress in Article 1, Section 8 have been the rights of the states before. So the libertarian liberals were not happy about Article 1, Section 8 because it was very conservative and giving these powers specifically to Congress. Okay? But then the 10th Amendment states that whatever is not specifically cited or enumerated as a right that the federal government has, and of course cannot be covered by the necessary and proper clause, is reserved to the states. So nothing is mentioned, for instance, about police powers, about education, right? About medical care. So by virtue of the 10th Amendment, most people would agree that those are state issues and the government is not to intervene and control them. All right. So any questions on that, on the federal part? So the state and local governments can have some of their own laws and their own tax system and so forth. But the federal government has certain powers now, such as in Article 1, Section 8, given to Congress, that it has power over the states. Okay? So constitutional, federal, and then the last word is republic. To the republic for which it stands. And remember, republic is to be a government that is representative of all the major classes and factions in society. That the wealthy and well-to-do are represented by elements of an aristocracy. Remember, aristoi meaning the best. So like our Supreme Court justices, handpicked, they're not supposed to make decisions that are popular, according to the founding fathers, but they're to adhere to what they believe is right, and also sometimes protect the minority, the numerical minority, right? But then you also should have congressmen who are elected by the people and held accountable by the majority, because the majority have just as much right as the aristocratic few to have a say in government. So hence a republic is a mixed government, right? That's partially democratic, partially aristocratic, and also partially monarchical, and giving strong power to a chief executive that has checks and powers with and over the other branches. So anyway, sorry that was long-winded, but that's the type of government we have, right? A constitutional federal republic. So going on to, where is it? Alleged problems. Okay, so we've already done that. Number 11, historian Pauline Maier on the ratification of our Constitution, and that created this republic in the summer of 1787, in the fall. Those who went to this place, right, under the Confederation had been elected by their states, citizens. So they took it upon themselves saying, hey, we've been elected to serve under the Confederation, so we're taking it upon ourselves to go and meet in Philadelphia and write a new constitution for a new government, right? They wrote it with closed doors. They kept the press out, right? When they were done, as they were finishing, right? And of course, they voted on it there amongst the 55 delegates and had people give their signature to it. Then they knew that with the Enlightenment, with Scottish liberalism both in vogue, with the religious Great Awakening in vogue, they knew they could not get away with just declaring this the new government without some form of popular ratification, popular approval to this new government. What you find is, in places like Pennsylvania and other areas, is they wanted to keep the ratification process away from the people as much as possible. Because again, for reasons you could guess, some, it was just pure elitism. Like, hey, we're the cream of the crop here, the most highly educated, well-read in history and philosophy and government, etc. Why should we have to go home and ask poor illiterate farmers if they're okay with this government or not? To others, it was more practical, and that they said, giving it open to the people to ratify will just open a can of worms. And everybody will fight and argue over the smallest things to the largest things. And it'll become so chaotic that we don't trust that it'll be ratified, right? And so at any rate, in some of the states, they tried to go back to the state and have the elected legislator ratify it without even printing it for the common people to read. So that's like grading your own paper, right? The very elected reps that are representing their states were the ones who went to the Constitutional Convention in the summer of Philadelphia of 1787 to write the Constitution. So if they wrote the Constitution, of course they're going to ratify it, right? It's their own work. So what happens in places like Massachusetts is the press goes crazy. and they write and say and tell the people, do not give your approval to this new government if they will not at least print out this document and allow the people in the colony to read it and see what type of government is being imposed upon them. So in Massachusetts, grudgingly, the writers of the Constitution from that state began allowing the printing of the Constitution. Then as it was read from state and village, town to town, different towns and cities began, especially small towns who had no official district in the state legislature. They didn't elect anybody just from their town. They did so now. They had an ad hoc, just on the spot election and elected local people to go uninvited into the state ratification convention and say, I am such and such from Braintree, Massachusetts, and the people in my town want to let you know we are not okay with this Constitution unless the following issues are addressed. And they would literally have a written list of issues. Okay? That happened a lot in Massachusetts. And it happened in about 4 other states as well. Well, what Pauline Maier writes, right, is that the founding fathers began to grudgingly and frighteningly, being afraid that this was not going to be ratified by 9 of 13 states, had to grudgingly concede and resign and say, fine, we'll allow these towns and people to send us their requirements, their ultimatums, and we will compromise with them. And the largest part of that compromise was the Bill of Rights. The founding fathers, you guys, did not initially put in a Bill of Rights. At the Constitutional Convention, you won't find it. But the people, that constituted an amalgamation of the demands made by the people, saying, we're not okay with this unless freedom of the press is specifically stated to be a protected right of the citizens. We're not okay with this unless suspects indicted for a crime have a trial of jury of their peers, have their stuff protected without a search warrant, don't have to incriminate themselves, be tortured into confessing something, etc. All right. So that is what we have with number 11. It's kind of a bittersweet one. That's number 2 on your assignment this week, right? Is that the founding fathers almost had to begrudgingly give in to popular pressure to make some enlightened and democratic additions or alterations to the Constitution to make the people happy. So it doesn't speak well of them in her book, but it speaks very well of the people, right? This notion that Americans are traditionally intolerant of tyranny. We demand our rights. And that type of legal sense of entitlement is a good thing and help bring about the Bill of Rights. Okay? So any questions? All right, and so I just have one more, and that is number 14. What type of economic system was devised? Even the conservatives agreed that we were not going to have the economic system of England, right? Whereby the king or queen could decide, I'm going to only allow the English East India Company to go to China, Sri Lanka, and India, buy tea, and sell it in the Boston Harbor. Only the English East India Company can do that, right? So granting monopolies. That went against the Enlightenment and Scottish liberalism, right? Giving favoritism, giving privileges to an elite group of people. That's not fair, right? Having lands closed off only for the noblemen and no chance for anyone to have an open market to buy or bid for land, much less go and squat on it, right? Those are all elements of the British system of mercantilism that even our conservatives despised. So what did they come with? Is they came forth with capitalism, right? And Adam Smith, in his Wealth and Poverty of Nations, wrote during the Enlightenment that there are natural laws to the universe, including psychological laws of how human beings interact and behave with one another and independently, and natural laws to the economy. And to him, right, the government ought to keep its nose out of the economy and let the natural laws of things do their thing. That was poorly articulated, but I hope you get my point. So the founding fathers, including the conservatives, they were for having capitalism, all right? Private enterprise. Technically, all lands are open for anyone to bid or to purchase, right? Or even sometimes to squat upon for free. Loans are to be available for everyone. Opportunities in colleges are to be allowed to everyone who's wealthy enough to pay for tuition and gets good enough grades and marks. Okay. However, it was never laissez-faire. LAISSEZ, right? Dash FAIRE. Laissez-faire. Let it be. Right? That's what Adam Smith wanted. The natural laws to the economy to do their thing and the government to stay out. We created a capitalist system. We liked how egalitarian that seemed, to put everyone on equal footing to freely compete with one another and without privileges and monopolies. But we were never laissez-faire. So remember that for the test. From the get-go, we had the government involved in the capitalist system. And I'm going to save that for 2 assignments from now, when we get into Hamilton's, quote, system under George Washington's reign as president. So I believe we have done today numbers 10 through 15. All right. Are there any questions?
No.
No. Okay. Andrea, any questions?
No.
Okay, huh? All right. Well, good. So we've done both numbers for your assignment this week, going from a confederacy to a republic, and we've done numbers 10 through 15 from that topic that are going to be found on your second test coming in a few weeks. Okay? So if that's all, like I said, ladies, you'll get extra credit for this. Everyone else, make sure that you watch this video. And you guys have a good day. Have a good week, okay?
You too.
You too.
Thank you. You as well. Bye-bye.